She had 3 days before they took everything. The ranch, the well, the only fresh water for 40 miles. Lenora Ashcombe had buried a husband, survived 2 brutal winters alone, and fought off drought with nothing but stubbornness and spite. But this was different. The men coming weren't weather. They didn't negotiate with seasons. They carried papers and pistols, and the kind of smiles that meant they'd already decided how things would end. And then a stranger walked through her gate. She didn't know his name yet, didn't know his past, his sins, or what he was running from. All she knew was that she had one move left, and it was the most desperate gamble of her life. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, because this one doesn't go where you think it does. The morning Rowan Mercer rode onto the Ashcombe property, the sky was doing that thing it does in Montana in late October, hanging low and gray and heavy, like a ceiling about to collapse. The kind of sky that makes a man feel small. The kind that makes a woman feel like everything she's built is one bad week from disappearing. Lenora saw him from the kitchen window before he even reached the gate. She wasn't the type to panic. 34 years of living had worn that particular instinct down to almost nothing. But she did reach for the rifle leaning against the doorframe. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way you might reach for a coat when you feel a chill. You didn't survive long on the Montana frontier by assuming strangers meant well. He was riding a bay horse that had seen better years, a little thin in the ribs, moving with the stiff patience of an animal that had been on the road too long. The man in the saddle matched it, tall, broad through the shoulders, but carrying himself with the kind of exhaustion that isn't just physical, the kind that settles into a person's spine and changes the way they hold their head. He stopped at the gate and didn't open it, just sat there, waiting. That told her something. Men who meant trouble didn't wait at gates. They rode through them, or around them, or they didn't bother with gates at all. This one sat still, hands visible, letting her come to him if she chose. She chose. Lenora walked out with the rifle in the crook of her arm, not pointed at him, but not exactly put away either. The wind had started moving through the grass in that low, restless way it did before real weather arrived, and she could feel winter on it, impatient and close. "Help you with something?" she called out. He pulled off his hat, brown hair gone a little long, jaw rough with maybe a week of beard, eyes that were some complicated shade between gray and green, the kind of eyes that had seen enough not to be surprised by much. He looked at her steadily, without the nervousness some men showed around a woman with a rifle, and without the arrogance of the ones who thought guns in women's hands were funny. "Name's Rowan Mercer," he said. "I'm looking for work. Heard your property might be short-handed." "Who told you that?" "Fellow in Millhaven, at the feed store. Said the Ashcombe spread had been running without a foreman since spring." Lenora studied him. The fellow at the feed store was Chet Barlow, which meant half the county already knew her situation in detail. That thought sat in her stomach like a cold stone. "The fellow at the feed store," she said, "talks too much." "Yes, ma'am, he does." Something about the way he said it, dry, without any attempt to charm her, made her lower the rifle another inch. "What kind of work can you do?" "Fencing, carpentry. I can shoe a horse, pull a breech calf, fix a pump, patch a roof. I'm not going to tell you I'm the best at any of it, but I don't quit when things get hard, and I don't steal." "Everyone says they don't steal." "Yes, ma'am, they do." She looked at his hands. There were things you could learn from a man's hands if you paid attention. His were scarred and calloused in the right places. Nails broken short, knuckles that had been split open enough times that the skin there had a particular kind of thickness. These were not the hands of a man who talked about work without doing it. "I'm not hiring right now," she said. It was a lie, and they both probably knew it, but he nodded without argument. "All right," he said. "I appreciate your time." He put his hat back on and gathered the reins. "Wait." She didn't entirely know why she said it. "You eaten today?" He paused. "This morning." "Come in then. I've got coffee and something left from last night." He looked at her for a moment like he was trying to work out whether there was a catch. Then he dismounted, looped his reins around the gatepost, and followed her toward the house. The kitchen was warm and smelled like wood smoke and something with onions. Rowan sat at the table while Lenora heated leftover venison stew and poured coffee into 2 tin cups. He didn't fill the space with unnecessary talking, which she appreciated. Most strangers felt compelled to perform themselves, to establish that they were trustworthy, harmless, charming. This man just sat with his coffee and waited. "You're not from around here," she said. It wasn't a question. Nebraska originally, been moving around. Moving around why? He looked at her with an expression that was almost amused. "You always interview people before you feed them?" "I interview everyone," she said. "It's my house." He considered that. "Fair enough. I had a homestead claim. Didn't work out." "Didn't work out how?" "Lost my wife. Couldn't stay after that." He said it the way people say things they've said many times before, not without feeling, but with the feeling kept somewhere internal, managed. Lenora understood that particular kind of management. "I lost my husband," she said, 14 months ago. Fever." "I'm sorry." "Don't be, I mean—" She stopped, set a bowl of stew in front of him. "I appreciate it. I just mean you don't have to say it like you're responsible." "All right." They ate in the particular silence of two people who had each survived something significant and didn't feel the need to make it into a performance. Outside, the wind picked up, and Lenora listened to it the way you listen to a sound you recognize as trouble. She'd been listening to a lot of things like that lately. After he finished eating, she could have thanked him and sent him on his way. She'd intended to, but the afternoon had other ideas. Rowan was still at the table when the sound of horses reached them. Not one or two, but several, moving fast up the road toward the property. Lenora was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand, and she was at the window before the first rider came into view. 3 men. She recognized the one in front. Dale Sutton, land agent for the Consolidated Range and Cattle Company, rode like a man who'd never been told no often enough. He was maybe 40, heavy through the middle, with a long mustache he was clearly proud of and the kind of easy confidence that came from having powerful employers. Beside him were 2 others she didn't know. Hired men, by the look of them, wearing matching coats that cost more than anything Lenora owned. "Who are they?" Rowan asked from behind her. "Trouble," she said. She went to the door. Sutton pulled up in the yard and didn't bother getting off his horse. That was deliberate. A man who stays mounted in your yard is making a statement about the relative importance of your time versus his. "Mrs. Ashcombe." He tipped his hat with the exaggerated courtesy of a man performing courtesy rather than feeling it. "Didn't realize you had company." "My business is my own, Mr. Sutton. State your purpose." "Same as last time." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope, which he extended toward her. When she didn't move forward to take it, he held it out another beat, then tucked it away with a slight smile. "Another offer. Better than the last one. The company is being quite generous considering." "Considering what?" "Considering the legal situation." He let that sit. "There are questions about the water rights on this property, Mrs. Ashcombe. The spring that feeds your ranch, the company's legal team has found some irregularities in the original deed. These things have a way of taking years to resolve in court, and in the meantime, a spread without reliable water access can become very difficult to operate." Lenora held the door frame. Her hands wanted to grip it hard, so she didn't let them. She kept her voice flat. "The deed was filed by my father-in-law in 1869. It's been confirmed twice." "Yes, well." Sutton smiled again, pleasantly. "Courts change their minds. Lawyers find things. That's just how these matters go." He glanced at Rowan, who had appeared beside Lenora in the doorway, not pushing forward, just present. "Your friend ought to understand that men with families, men with futures, they don't usually want to get mixed up in something like this." Rowan said nothing. "Think about the offer, Mrs. Ashcombe," Sutton said. "Winter's coming. That changes a lot of calculations." He turned his horse, and the 3 of them rode back toward the road at the same easy pace they'd arrived. Lenora stood in the doorway for a long moment after they were gone. The wind moved through the yard, stirring up dust and a few dry leaves. "How long has that been going on?" Rowan asked. "Since June," she said, "when they realized my husband wasn't coming back and I wasn't selling." She went back inside. Rowan followed. She sat at the kitchen table and didn't pour more coffee because her hands were doing a slight tremor she didn't want him to see. He sat across from her and didn't comment on anything. "The spring is the key," she said, because she found she was going to tell him anyway. There was something about his quality of attention, the way he listened without waiting for his turn to speak, that made you want to talk honestly. It's the only freshwater source in this valley besides the creek, and the creek runs dry in August. My husband's family built this ranch around that spring in 1869. Without it, this land is worth almost nothing for ranching. With it, she stopped. It's worth a great deal, Rowan said. To me, to them, but for different reasons. She looked at the table. To me, it's home. To them, it's leverage over every rancher in this territory. He was quiet. Then, what are you going to do? I don't know yet, she said, which was true. She had about 3 ideas, and all of them were bad. Okay. She didn't sleep that night. This was not unusual lately. She'd become a poor sleeper since Thomas died, lying awake in the large bed doing arithmetic on problems that didn't have clean solutions. But that night she lay staring at the ceiling with something new turning over in her mind. She'd been thinking about it for weeks, actually, since the last time Sutton had come around, when he'd brought 4 men with him and stood in her yard asking her, gently, whether she was sure she didn't want to reconsider. She'd stood alone on her porch with an empty rifle. The bullets were inside, which was an embarrassing error she hadn't made before and hadn't made since. And she'd felt for the first time since Thomas died that she might actually lose this. A woman alone on the frontier faced a particular kind of vulnerability that had nothing to do with personal strength. It was structural. She could be the toughest, sharpest, most capable person in the territory, and it still wouldn't change the fact that a woman without a husband had fewer legal protections, fewer allies willing to risk anything on her behalf, and no one to stand beside her in a yard when 4 men rode in uninvited. She needed someone beside her. Not a hired hand. Hired hands could be paid off or threatened. She needed someone with a stake in this. When morning came and Rowan was still there, she'd given him the use of the small outbuilding without quite meaning to. She brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him at the rough table he'd set up in the yard to repair a piece of fence hardware. She put the coffee down and looked at the mountains for a moment. They were pink with the early light and dusted at the peaks with the first snow of the season. I have something to ask you, she said. All right. It's going to sound... She stopped, decided not to warn him. I want you to marry me. The silence that followed had a specific quality to it, like the pause after a stone hits water. Rowan set down his work. He looked at her the way she imagined she looked when someone put down a hand of cards she hadn't expected, carefully, trying to read what was real. Mrs. Ashcombe. Lenora. She kept her eyes on the mountains. If you're going to answer me either way, you should probably use my name. He was quiet for a moment. Lenora, you just met me yesterday. I know that. You don't know anything about me. I know you waited at my gate. I know you didn't flinch when Sutton looked at you like you were something on the bottom of his boot. I know you didn't ask me a single question about what you might be getting into when you came out of that kitchen doorway behind me. She finally looked at him. I know you ate my stew and you said thank you, and you didn't volunteer anything you didn't mean. He sat very still. This isn't romantic, she said. She felt the need to make that clear, and she said it without embarrassment, which cost her something, actually, to manage. I'm not asking because of any feeling I have that isn't strictly practical. I need a husband on paper, legally, a man whose name sits next to mine on that deed, who can stand next to me in a courthouse, who can be in this yard when Sutton comes back with more men. She paused. I'm offering you a share of this property, a real one. The ranch is worth something if we can hold it. I'll put your name on a document, a fair one, written down, witnessed. Half the property in exchange for 1 year of real partnership. After that, if you want to go, you go. If I want to ask you to leave, I can. But for 1 year, I need you to stay and fight for this with me. Rowan looked at the mountains, at the coffee in his hands, at some middle distance she couldn't quite read. That's a considerable offer, he said. I know what it is. It's also a considerable risk for you. Yes. You're trusting a stranger with your property. I'm out of better options, she said. And I told you, I've been watching you. Since you rode through that gate, I've been paying attention. He was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere back toward the barn, one of her horses made a low complaint. What happened to your husband? He asked finally. Fever, like I said. Did you love him? The question surprised her, not in a bad way, but in the way of a question you didn't expect to be asked directly. Yes, she said. Not perfectly, but honestly. Rowan nodded slowly at that, as if it was the kind of answer that made sense to him. As if perfectly was an option he'd stopped believing in himself. I haven't stayed anywhere in almost 3 years, he said. I know. I'm not easy to live with. I don't talk much. I have bad nights sometimes. I have bad nights, she said. I don't need you to be easy. Another long silence. All right, he said. She looked at him. All right, he said again, as if confirming it to himself as much as to her. I'll stay. We'll do this. She nodded once, businesslike, though something inside her that had been braced hard for a long time moved, slightly, like a door on a stiff hinge. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated. The feeling of having committed to a thing you're not sure about, but knowing the alternative was worse. We'll go into town tomorrow and speak to the justice of the peace, she said. Bring whatever papers you have. We'll make it legal quickly. All right. He picked up his coffee, drank it, put it down. Lenora? Yes. I won't steal from you. She almost smiled. Almost. Everyone says that, she said. I know, he said, but I mean it. Justice of the peace. Harold Gear performed the ceremony in his office above the hardware store in Millhaven, with his secretary Mabel as witness, and the scratchy sound of someone hammering nails in the shop below as accompaniment. It took 10 minutes. Gear was a small, formal man who wore his reading glasses on the end of his nose and had apparently decided that whatever had brought these two in front of him was none of his business, because he read the words with perfect official neutrality and didn't offer any opinion one way or the other. Lenora wore her good dress, which was brown wool and not particularly festive, and Rowan wore his cleanest shirt, which still showed the ghost of a stain near the collar that she suspected he'd tried to get out that morning without success. They stood a careful foot apart in front of Gear's desk. When Gear asked whether either of them objected, there was a moment where neither of them looked at the other. They both stared straight ahead like soldiers standing for inspection, and then it passed. When Gear told Rowan he could kiss his bride, there was a pause, and then Rowan leaned over and placed a brief, careful kiss on her cheek, which was perhaps 3 seconds long and warmer than she'd expected. And she caught a smell of soap and something like cedar that she immediately filed away and tried not to think about again. Mabel signed the certificate with a pen that skipped and had to be scratched over twice. She looked at Lenora with an expression of complicated sympathy that Lenora decided not to examine. Outside on the wooden sidewalk, they stood in the pale autumn light. Well, Lenora said. Well, Rowan said, we should probably talk about how we're going to handle people asking questions. Probably, he agreed. They walked back to where their horses were tied without resolving that particular question, which turned out to be fine because the answer presented itself almost immediately in the form of Chet Barlow stepping out of the feed store and stopping dead at the sight of them together. Chet's eyes moved between them, made a rapid calculation, and arrived at an expression of almost comical astonishment. Mrs. Ashcombe, he said, are you and this fellow Mercer, Rowan said pleasantly. Rowan Mercer, you'd be Chet. How does he know my name? Lenora, did you just... Good afternoon, Chet, Lenora said, untying her horse. By sundown, the news would be in every kitchen in the county. Millhaven was a town of 300 people, which meant it was a town where everyone knew everything about everyone and had opinions about all of it. Lenora had lived within its orbit for 9 years and understood its rhythms. The gossip moved like water, finding every crack, pooling in unexpected places. The story of her marriage hit the town like a stone hits a pond. By the second day, she could feel it when she went to pick up supplies at Henderson's store. The conversations that stopped half a beat too late. The looks that people composed carefully into neutrality when they saw her, which told her exactly what those looks had been before she'd walked in. She'd grown up understanding that a woman's choices were public property in a way that a man's simply weren't, and she'd made her peace with that the way you make your peace with bad weather, not happily, but practically. What she hadn't entirely prepared for was people saying things directly to her face. Eleanor Marsh, whose husband ran the bank and who had appointed herself the territory's moral authority some years back, caught Lenora outside the post office on the 4th day. Eleanor's voice had that particular quality, warm on the surface, something harder underneath. I heard the news. I have to say, We're all a bit. She paused, choosing her words with the care of someone selecting the best stone to throw. Concerned. About what, Eleanor? About you, of course. A widow, barely finished grieving, taking up with someone no one knows anything about. Thomas hasn't been gone a year. Thomas has been gone 14 months, Lenora said. Well? Eleanor pressed her lips together. It seems very sudden. Life on this ranch doesn't allow for prolonged deliberation, Lenora said. Excuse me. She walked away with her back straight and her heart hitting a little harder than she would have liked. Because the thing about people like Eleanor Marsh was that they weren't entirely wrong. It was sudden. And whatever logic had driven the decision didn't change the fact that she was now legally bound to a man she'd met 4 days ago, and she had to live inside that decision every day while everyone around her picked it apart. Rowan didn't seem troubled by any of it. This was both admirable and slightly irritating. He went about the work of the ranch with a quiet, methodical competence that steadied everything it touched. The eastern fence line, which had been sagging dangerously since August, was repaired and reinforced within 3 days. The well pump, which had been developing a worrying groan, was disassembled, cleaned, and put back together so that it ran smoother than it had in years. He found a weakness in the roof of the main barn that she hadn't noticed and fixed it before the first real rain arrived. He worked like someone who found comfort in work the way other people found comfort in conversation. One evening, she found him in the barn after dark, by lantern light, repairing a piece of tack that he could just as easily have left until morning. You don't have to work yourself until midnight, she said. I know. He didn't stop. I sleep better if I'm tired. She leaned against the doorframe. The barn smelled like hay and horse and the sharp mineral smell of lantern oil. Bad nights, she said, remembering what he'd told her before they'd made the deal. He glanced up briefly. Sometimes. What are they about? He considered the question, or rather, he held the question for a moment without immediately deflecting it. Mostly about what I didn't do, he said finally. Things I should have done different. For your wife? The needle he was using on the leather paused for just a moment. Partly, he said. Partly other things. She waited to see if he'd say more. He didn't, and she didn't push. There was a difference between privacy and deception, and she was learning to read which one this was. He wasn't hiding from her. He was just someone who moved slowly toward things, and she could understand that, because she was too. The roof on the smokehouse needs looking at, she said, because that was safer ground. I'll do it tomorrow. She went back to the house. She was careful not to think about the needle pausing. 2 weeks after the wedding, Lenora went into Millhaven for supplies, and Rowan came with her because she needed another pair of hands. And also, though she didn't say this, because she'd started to notice that his presence changed the character of certain interactions in a way that was purely practical and not at all something she thought about. Sutton was at the saloon when they passed it. He came out onto the board sidewalk with his thumbs in his vest and the look of a man who'd just won a hand of cards. Mrs. Ashcombe, he said, then, with deliberate pause, and this must be the new husband. Rowan stopped walking. He turned toward Sutton with an expression that was almost nothing, almost completely neutral, but something about it made Sutton's easy smile go fractionally tighter. Sutton, Lenore said, we're not stopping. I heard congratulations were in order, Sutton said. Though I'll admit I was surprised. What's it been? 5 days? A week? You must be quite the charmer, Mr. Mercer. He was trying to find the nerve. Rowan's nerve, specifically, the particular nerve that a certain kind of insult hits in a man. The implication that he'd been played, used, that the woman had gotten the better of the deal somehow, that he should feel foolish. Thank you for the kind words, Rowan said. His voice was perfectly even. Good afternoon. He put his hand lightly on Lenora's elbow, not possessively, not for show, but in the way of someone indicating direction. And they walked on. Sutton called something after them, but Lenora couldn't have repeated it afterward. Her attention had gone entirely to the spot where Rowan's hand had rested for exactly 2 seconds on her arm, which she noted clinically and promptly set aside. Later, loading supplies into the wagon, Rowan said, He's trying to make you feel isolated. I know. Make you think no one in this town is on your side. I know. She hefted a sack of flour. Is he wrong? Rowan took the sack from her and put it in the wagon without making a thing of it. I don't know enough about this town yet. He picked up the next one. But I know that no one in that street came out to agree with him either. It was a small thing. It steadied her in a small way. Small was what you had sometimes. October gave way to November, and November brought the kind of cold that wasn't just temperature but intention. The mountains disappeared behind clouds and reappeared wearing new white. The mornings turned the water in the troughs to thin ice that had to be broken before the animals could drink. Rowan and Lenora fell into the rhythms of the ranch the way two people fall into any shared undertaking, with friction at first and then with the gradual, unannounced development of a system. He learned that she drank her coffee black and that she was not a person to be spoken to directly in the first 15 minutes of her morning. He learned that she kept everything in its place with a precision that had the feeling of something held on to after other things had been lost, and that moving an object without asking created a particular quiet that was worse than any argument. She learned that he put himself to bed with a book every night that he clearly wasn't reading. She could tell by the fact that the page never turned, and that he actually slept sitting upright in the chair sometimes, which she didn't mention. She learned that he had a sense of humor that was very dry and almost entirely deadpan, and that if you were paying attention, you could catch it, and if you weren't, you'd miss it entirely. She paid attention. One evening in the second week of November, they were sitting on opposite sides of the kitchen table, Lenora with the ranch ledger, Rowan with a piece of harness he was working on, and the stove was going and the lamp was throwing orange light on everything, and there was a particular quality of quiet in the room that wasn't lonely. Lenora looked up from the ledger. "What happened to your claim?" she said. "In Nebraska." He didn't look up from the harness. "Which part?" "All of it." He was quiet for a moment, then, "My wife, her name was Clara, she got sick in the third year, lung sickness. She was from Tennessee. She didn't have it in her to deal with a Nebraska winter, I think. Or maybe it would have happened anywhere. I don't know." He ran the leather through his hands slowly. "She died in February. I tried to stay through spring, but..." He stopped. "But you couldn't," Lenore said. "The land was full of her," he said, "every corner of it. I couldn't walk from the house to the well without..." He didn't finish that sentence. "So I left. And you've been moving since." "For 3 years, yes." She looked back at the ledger. The numbers blurred slightly. "Thomas and I built this kitchen together," she said. "Third year we were here. He was not a gifted carpenter. The window frame is about a half-inch off plumb, and it bothered him until the day he died." She paused. "It still bothers me, but now it's the way it bothers you when something reminds you of a person. It's a different feeling." Rowan looked at the window frame. "I see it," he said. "Yes." She looked at the numbers again. "I understand why you left," she said. "I thought about leaving, but there's no version of leaving here that..." She stopped. "This place is Thomas, and it's his family, and it's mine, and if I leave it, I lose all of them twice." He didn't say anything for a moment, then, "That's why you're fighting so hard." "That's why." The fire in the stove popped. Outside, the wind moved around the corners of the house with the particular sound of November wind in Montana, which is like a conversation in a language you can't quite understand. "I'm sorry about Clara," Lenora said. "I'm sorry about Thomas," he said. They went back to what they were doing. The lamp burned low. Neither of them moved to refill it. December came in with teeth. The first real storm hit on the third night of the month. Not the worst storm the territory had seen, but serious enough. 8 inches of snow and wind that made the walls of the house audible. Lenora was up before dawn stoking the fire, and Rowan was already in the barn, which she hadn't heard him go out to. She pulled on her coat and boots and went out. The barn was cold but sheltered, the animals restless with the sound of the storm on the roof. Rowan was moving between the stalls, checking water, spreading extra hay, running a quiet hand along the flank of the most nervous of the horses, a dark roan mare named Spite, which Thomas had named, characteristically, because she'd been impossible to gentle at first. Spite tolerated Rowan now. This had happened gradually enough that Lenora hadn't noticed it until she saw it plainly. "You should have woken me," she said. "You were asleep. The animals are my responsibility." He glanced at her. "The animals are our responsibility," he said, without any particular emphasis, just as a statement of fact. She didn't argue with that. She took the far side of the barn, and they worked through it together in the dim early light. The storm muffled outside, and there was something in the shared necessity of it, in the absolute lack of drama, in just doing the thing that needed doing, that felt more real than anything Lenora could have put into words. What she didn't say was that she'd been lying awake listening to the storm for an hour before she got up, and that part of what she'd been doing was listening for him, for the sounds that might tell her he was somewhere dealing with something alone, and that when she'd heard the barn door, the particular kind of tension that had been in her shoulders had let go in a way she wasn't ready to examine yet. That afternoon, after the storm had eased and the world had gone white and still, a rider came up the road, one of the smaller ranchers from the valley's south end, a man named Presley Dunn, who ran about 40 head of cattle and had always treated Lenora with the distant but genuine respect that some men extended to women who clearly knew what they were doing. He pulled up short of the gate, which had drifted in snow, and called out. Rowan went to meet him. Lenora watched from the window. She couldn't hear what was said, but she could read the character of the conversation. Dunn's hat in his hands, his manner serious, Rowan listening. After a few minutes, Rowan nodded, and Dunn rode back down the road. Rowan came inside. He stomped the snow off his boots and didn't immediately say anything, which meant the news was something that needed a moment of consideration before it was given. Well, Lenora said. Consolidated Range bought out the Harker property 2 weeks ago, he said, and the Morrison place apparently last month. They've been quiet about it. Dunn says there's a rumor they've got legal papers on file in Helena challenging the water rights on 3 of the valley properties. 3, she said. Which 3? Dunn's, the Caldwell spread, and ours. She sat down. Dunn says there are others who'd fight if... Rowan paused. If they had reason to think the fight was winnable. She looked at him. What did you tell him? I told him I'd talk to you. She appreciated that. Some men would have told Dunn what they thought and brought Lenora the answer rather than the question. She filed this away without comment. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow glittered in the afternoon light with the indifferent beauty of a landscape that did not care at all about any of this. We can't fight this alone, she said. No, he agreed. But if Dunn and Caldwell, and maybe 2 others, if we're unified, if we all have lawyers, if we make noise, it gets harder for them to make it disappear quietly, Rowan said. Yes. She thought about it. The ranch ledger said they had enough to cover 1 more month of full operating costs, and then they'd be making difficult decisions. Lawyers cost money. A coalition costs time and trust, and the willingness of people who were already struggling to take on more risk. But surrender cost more. Write to Dunn, she said. Tell him we'd like to meet with anyone who's willing. Before Christmas, if we can. Rowan nodded. He went to the small desk in the corner and pulled out paper and ink, which he handled with more ease than she'd have expected. His handwriting, she noticed when she looked over his shoulder at one point, was precise and clear, not the scrawl of someone barely literate. Another small piece of him she filed away. He wrote the letter. She sealed it. Outside, the snow began to glow with the particular pink-orange of a Montana sunset in winter, the kind that was so purely beautiful it felt almost aggressive, given everything. Lenora watched it through the off-plumb window frame. She was still afraid. She'd be a fool not to be. But the fear had a different texture now, not the spinning, airless fear of being completely alone, but something more like the fear you feel standing at the edge of something high, looking down. Uncomfortable. Real, but not paralyzing. Behind her, she could hear Rowan's pen moving across the paper. She let herself feel, just briefly and privately, the solidity of someone else in the room. Then she went back to the ledger. There was still work to do. The letter reached Presley Dunn by the following morning, carried by a boy Rowan had paid 2 bits to ride south. By Thursday of that same week, 6 people sat around Lenora's kitchen table, which was not large enough for 6 people, and showed it. Dunn had brought his wife, a quiet woman named Ruth, who said almost nothing but watched everything with the focused attention of someone taking notes. Caldwell came alone, a big, slow-moving man in his 50s with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades reading weather and land. There were 2 others, a younger rancher named Pike Emmett who ran sheep on the western ridge and whose presence surprised Lenora because she'd assumed he wouldn't want the trouble, and an older widow named Frances Bauer who owned 40 acres south of the creek and who came in, sat down, and immediately said, "Let's not waste time being polite about this." "What's the plan?" Lenora liked Frances Bauer. The plan, such as it was, took 2 hours to work out and satisfied no one completely, which Rowan told her afterward was probably a sign it was realistic. They would pool what they could toward a single lawyer in Helena, a man named Aldous Crane, whom Dunn had heard of through his brother-in-law, a man reputed to know land law well and to dislike large corporations on principle, which was not strictly a legal credential but felt relevant. Each property owner would send a copy of their original deed and any correspondence from Consolidated Range to Crane by the end of the month. They would not sell. They would not respond to any further offers without first consulting each other. It was a coalition of frightened people who didn't entirely trust each other, operating on limited funds, against a company with lawyers on salary and money that didn't run short. When Lenora laid it out to herself plainly, the odds were not good. She didn't say that to the people sitting at her table. Some things you kept to yourself not because you were being dishonest, but because other people's courage was a fragile thing, and you didn't go around poking at it unnecessarily. After everyone left, Rowan washed the coffee cups in the basin, and Lenora sat with the ledger open in front of her without looking at it. "Crane's going to want a retainer," she said. "Yes." "We don't have it." He was quiet for a moment. He dried a cup with the cloth hanging from the oven handle. "I have some money," he said, "saved from the last year of working. It's not a lot, but it's something." She looked at him. "That's yours." "I know it's mine," he said. "I'm telling you I'll put it in." "Rowan, you're not taking charity," he said before she could frame the objection. "You're taking a partner's investment in a shared property. Those are different things." He set the cup down. "Unless you're going to argue that they're the same, in which case I'll point out that you're tired and the argument will be better tomorrow." She opened her mouth and then closed it. He was right, which was irritating. She was tired. The kind of tired that had been building since June and had recently passed through ordinary exhaustion into something more chronic and settled. "Fine," she said. "Good." She went to bed. She didn't sleep immediately, but the fear was manageable, and that was more than she'd had a month ago. The money went to Helena with the deed copies 2 weeks before Christmas. Aldous Crane wrote back, a short, precise letter that told them little except that he'd received the materials and would be in touch after the new year. It wasn't reassuring exactly, but it was something on paper with a professional signature, and that counted for more than it probably should have. Christmas came and went without ceremony. Lenora put a branch of pine in a jar on the table because Thomas had always done it, and stopping felt like a defeat over something small enough to win. Rowan noticed it but didn't comment, which was the right response. He'd gone into town 2 days before and come back with a small package that he left on the table without explanation. A pair of good work gloves, leather, better quality than anything she currently owned, sized correctly for her hands. She thanked him once and didn't make a production of it. He acknowledged the thanks with a nod. They ate a reasonable dinner in the warm kitchen, and the wind was very loud outside, and neither of them said much. But the quiet was the kind that had stopped being uncomfortable sometime in the past few weeks without either of them deciding that it had. January was cruel in the way January in Montana is always cruel, relentlessly, impersonally, without any of the drama of the storms of early winter. Just cold that didn't break, that sat on the land and dared it to produce anything worth having. The cattle needed more feed. One of the mares developed a cough that worried Lenora for 10 days before it cleared on its own. The pump froze twice, and both times Rowan was out in the dark before dawn getting it running again with rags soaked in hot water and language she pretended not to hear through the kitchen window. She brought him coffee through the back door one of those mornings. He was crouched over the pump housing with his coat pulled up and his breath making clouds in the gray dark, and his hands, bare, because gloves made the work harder, were an alarming shade of red. "Here," she said. He took the cup without looking up, drank half of it. Then he looked at her. There was something exhausted and slightly wild in his face in the pre-dawn cold, the look of a man who had been fighting something tedious for an hour and was winning, but unhappily. "It's going to need a new valve before spring," he said. "The seal is cracking." "How much?" "I'll find out." She looked at his hands. "Put your gloves on when you're done." "I know." "I'm just saying." "I know, Lenora." But there was something in the way he said her name in that moment that was less like a response and more like something else. She went back inside before she could work out what. The letter from Aldous Crane arrived in the 3rd week of January, and it was not the letter any of them had wanted. Crane had reviewed the deed materials carefully. The Ashcombe deed, he wrote, was solid, better documented than most from that era, and he was confident it could withstand a legal challenge. However, the water rights were a different matter. The original deed included a clause granting water access from the spring, but the clause had been written in language that was, by the standards of 1892 territorial law, genuinely ambiguous. Consolidated Range's lawyers had found the ambiguity and were prepared to exploit it. A challenge would be expensive, uncertain, and slow. He estimated costs in the hundreds of dollars and a timeline of 18 months to 3 years. Lenora read the letter twice and then set it on the table. Rowan read it, folded it carefully, set it down. 18 months, she said. At minimum, he said. We can't sustain this property for 18 months at current expenditure without the spring being... She stopped, reorganized. We need the spring functioning and legally clear to operate at scale. If it's contested in court, we can't build the herd, we can't make contracts, we can't... I know, he said. We don't have the money for 3 years of legal costs. I know. She looked at her hands on the table, then at the window frame that was off by half an inch, then at the pine branch in its jar, which had gone dry and brown at the edges. Tell me what you're thinking, Rowan said. Not as a demand, as a genuine question, the kind that meant he'd listen to the actual answer. I'm thinking, she said slowly, that we need something other than a lawyer. He waited. Crane can hold the legal ground, she said. Keep them from winning outright. But what we actually need is for Consolidated Range to decide this isn't worth pursuing, for them to look at this valley and decide there's an easier place to put their money. She looked at him. What makes a company like that change its mind? Rowan considered the question as he considered all questions, without rushing it. Cost, he said. If the cost of taking something exceeds the value of having it, you find something else to take. So we need to make this more expensive for them. Or less valuable. He paused. Or both. How do you make land with the only spring in a valley less valuable to a company that wants water access? You make sure everyone in the territory knows what they're doing, he said, loudly, so that when they move to the next valley, they're already known there, so that legislators have heard of them, so that it's not quiet. Lenora looked at him. You want to make noise. I want them to feel watched, he said. Men doing things they're not proud of move differently when they feel watched. She thought about that. It wasn't a plan exactly. It was more like the beginning of one, a direction to start walking before you can see the destination. But she'd started with less. I'll write to the territorial paper, she said, the one in Helena. They've run stories on land disputes before. And I'll talk to Dunn and Caldwell, Rowan said. See if they'll put their names to a statement. The more names, the harder to ignore. It wasn't the victory she wanted. It wasn't even close. But it was something to do, and doing something was better than sitting still and watching the walls close in. They wrote that evening, Lenore at the desk and Rowan at the table with his own paper, each of them working in parallel in the lamplight. She was aware of him in the particular way she'd become aware of him over these weeks. Not intrusively, but the way you're aware of something that has become part of the background of a place. The scratch of his pen, the occasional pause where he looked at nothing and worked something out. The way he'd shift in his chair when he'd been sitting too long. A slight rotation of one shoulder, like something had stiffened. She made a mistake in her letter and crossed it out and started a line over. You write better than me, he said, without looking up. I don't know what makes you say that. You don't cross things out and then cross out the cross-outs. She looked at her page. This was fair. My teacher was strict. Where'd you grow up? Ohio, small town. You'd never have heard of it. She kept writing. My father was a school teacher. He thought handwriting was a moral quality. Was he right? About that specific thing? No. He was right about a lot of other things, though. She paused. He didn't want me to come west. He thought Thomas was too adventurous. She almost smiled at the word. That was how he said it, adventurous, meaning reckless. Was he, Thomas? A little. The almost smile completed itself briefly and then faded. That was part of why I loved him. He believed things would work out. I don't naturally believe things will work out. I need evidence first. So having someone who did was... She stopped. Useful, Rowan offered. I was going to say comforting. She looked at her letter. But useful is also true. My wife was the opposite of me in the same way, Rowan said. She laughed easily. I don't particularly. She thought I was funny, which I'm still not sure was accurate, but I didn't argue. Lenora looked at him. He was still looking at his paper, but his expression had that quality she recognized now. The careful, managed distance of someone holding something close enough that they could feel it, but not so close it overwhelmed them. She sounds like she was good for you, Lenora said. She was, he said simply. They went back to writing. The fire burned. The Montana dark pressed against the windows. When she sealed her letter to the Helena paper, she didn't know if it would matter. When Rowan finished his and set it aside to dry, he didn't look like a man who expected miracles. What he looked like was a man who'd decided to keep going regardless, to do the next thing, and then the next, and see what accumulated. She understood that impulse better than she would have admitted. The letters went out the following morning. The valley sat under its January cold, quiet, and indifferent, and very large. Somewhere in Helena, lawyers were looking at documents. Somewhere in the territory, a company with significant resources was calculating how much resistance was worth. And on the Ashcombe Ranch, which stubbornly refused to be anything other than the Ashcombe Ranch, two people who had married for practical reasons and were finding that practice made for unexpected complications went about the business of keeping things alive through the winter. Sutton came back in the last week of January. This time he came alone. No hired men, no performance. He rode up to the house in the late afternoon when the light was already failing and the temperature was dropping hard, and he tied his horse at the gate and knocked. Lenora answered. Rowan was somewhere at the back of the property. She could hear the distant sound of him splitting wood. Sutton looked older than he had in October. Or maybe just tired. He was still well-dressed, still had the mustache, but something in his face had shifted slightly. A quality of certainty had gone out of it. Mrs. Ashcombe, he said, I'd like to talk. Without... He glanced toward the sound of the axe. Just the two of us, if you're willing. She thought about it, decided she was curious enough. Come in, she said. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where 6 frightened ranchers had sat in December, the same table where she and Rowan had written letters by lamplight. And he held his hat in his hands, and he did not look like a man who held good cards. The company is aware of the Helena paper story, he said. The story had run 2 weeks prior, a modest piece, half a column, describing the pattern of pressure tactics used against valley ranchers. Not front page, but visible. Good, Lenora said. They're not pleased. Also good. He looked at his hat. Mrs. Ashcombe, I'm going to say something to you that I'm not authorized to say. What I mean is, this is coming from me, not from the company. He paused. The company is going to escalate. I've heard talks about what the next step looks like, and it's... He stopped. Started again. They're not going to stop at letters and legal challenges. They have other methods. Lenora kept her face still. Why are you telling me this? Because I've been doing this work for 7 years, he said. And He made a small, frustrated motion with his hat. There are lines I understood I was crossing, and I crossed them anyway, because that's the job. But what they're talking about now... He stopped again. I have a daughter, he said. She's 9. That's not an excuse. I'm telling you who I am so you understand where this is coming from. The axe outside had stopped. What are they planning? Lenora said. I don't know the specifics. I know it involves the men who came with me that first day, and others like them. He looked at her directly. You need to be ready for something more serious than a legal challenge, and you need people who'll stand with you when it comes. The back door opened and Rowan came in, stamping snow from his boots, and he saw Sutton immediately and went completely still for a moment in the doorway. That very particular quality of stillness that Lenora had come to recognize as him making a rapid assessment. Mr. Mercer, Sutton said. Rowan looked at Lenora. A question without words. Mr. Sutton was just leaving, Lenora said. She stood. Thank you for coming, she said to Sutton, and she meant it, even though the words felt strange. I heard you. Sutton nodded, put his hat on. He glanced at Rowan on his way out, a glance that was not hostile but had something complicated in it, some recognition of something, and then the door closed behind him. The kitchen was quiet. What was that? Rowan said. A warning, she said. Or a conscience. Maybe both. She looked at the closed door. They're going to send men. Real ones, not paper pushers. Rowan was quiet for a moment. When? He didn't know. He moved to the window, looked out at the dark yard, the pale snow, the road disappearing into the early evening. His jaw was set in the particular way it went when he was working something out. "We need to tell Dunn and Caldwell," he said. "Tonight," she agreed. Outside, Sutton's horse moved down the road and disappeared into the dark. The cold came in under the door in the way it always did, no matter how many times Rowan had restuffed the gap with rags. Some things you couldn't fully seal against. You just kept the fire going and stood close to it and stayed ready. Lenore put another log in the stove. Rowan was already getting his coat. They rode to Dunn's place that night in the dark and the cold, the horses picking their way carefully along the road that had gone icy at the edges where the packed snow had melted and refrozen through the day. Lenora had made this ride enough times to know it by feel more than sight, but she was aware of Rowan beside her, the sounds of his horse, the occasional creak of his saddle, in a way that she couldn't have explained and didn't try to. Dunn answered the door in his long underwear with a rifle, which was reasonable given the hour, and then stood aside to let them in when he saw who it was. Ruth Dunn appeared from the back of the house in a robe with her dark hair loose, took one look at their faces, and put a pot of coffee on without being asked. They told it plainly. Sutton's visit, the warning, what it likely meant. Dunn sat at his table and listened with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man receiving news he'd been expecting and dreading in equal measure. When Lenora finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How many men you think they'll send?" he said. "Enough to be serious," Rowan said. "Not so many it looks like an army. 4, maybe 5. The kind that make a point without leaving obvious evidence of how they made it. Meaning they'll damage something," Dunn said. "Or someone." "That's my read." Ruth set down the coffee cups without comment. She'd been listening from the stove. "We can't fight them with rifles," Lenora said. "Even if we had the numbers, that's a road that ends badly for everyone who lives here and well for everyone who doesn't." "So what do we do?" Dunn asked. "We make sure we're not alone when they come," Rowan said. "That's the first thing. If it's just one property at a time, in the dark, they can do what they want and say nothing happened. But if there are witnesses, people who saw what they did and who they are, it's a different calculation for the company." "A watch," Dunn said. "More or less, rotating. 2 people on the most vulnerable properties on any given night. Nothing aggressive, just present, visible." Dunn looked at his wife. Something passed between them that Lenora recognized as a private language developed over years of shared difficulty. Ruth gave a small, firm nod. "All right," Dunn said. "I'll talk to Caldwell tomorrow. And Pike, he's got 2 brothers who aren't afraid of a late night." They rode home in the same dark and cold they'd ridden out in. The moon had come up by then, throwing blue-white light across the snow, and the mountains were visible against the sky in a way they weren't in daylight, black and enormously present, like walls around a room you hadn't noticed you were inside. "You think this is going to work?" Lenora asked. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out because she was tired and the cold made her honest. Rowan thought about it with the same unhurried consideration he gave everything. "I think it's better than not doing it," he said. "Whether it works depends on a lot of things we can't control." "That's not a comforting answer." "You didn't ask for a comforting answer." She looked at the road ahead. "No," she said. "I suppose I didn't." The first 10 days of February were quiet in the way that made Lenora's shoulders stay permanently tense. Nothing happened. No riders came. No new letters arrived from Consolidated Ranges lawyers or from Aldous Crane. The watch rotation started. Dunn's eldest son on alternate nights, one of Pike Emmett's brothers on the others. And it all felt necessary and slightly absurd at the same time, the way preparations for something catastrophic often do before the catastrophe arrives. Rowan said little about it, but Lenora could read his watchfulness. He began checking the perimeter of the property each morning before breakfast, a habit she noticed because she woke early and heard the door. He started keeping the rifle closer, not visibly, not in a way designed to be seen, but accessible. She found herself doing the same. They'd developed a strange domestic economy by now, her and Rowan, full of unspoken agreements and small accommodations. He cooked on Tuesdays and Thursdays without either of them deciding that was the arrangement. It had just settled that way. She handled the ranch accounts entirely and kept him informed of what he needed to know without making him sit through the parts that were just numbers. He fixed things without being asked, which had bothered her briefly because it made her feel like she'd been letting things go. And then she'd gotten over that because she had been letting things go, because there was only one of her and there was too much to do. When she couldn't sleep, which was often, she read at the kitchen table, and twice he had come out in the night for water and found her there. And both times he'd just poured himself a glass, looked at whatever she was reading, and gone back to his room without making her explain herself. It was not a romantic arrangement. She reminded herself of this regularly and with some force, because there were moments that threatened to blur the line, and she had a strict policy about that line. The arrangement was practical. It had a legal end date. They had both known that from the beginning. She reminded herself of this particularly one evening in the second week of February when they were sitting by the stove after supper and he was reading, actually reading this time, something she'd noticed because he was on page 50 of the same book he'd been carrying for a month, and he'd finally seemed to crack it. And the fire was doing that thing where it goes low and orange and warm, and the sound of the wind outside makes the inside feel more interior, more separate from everything difficult. She looked at him and he looked up at the same moment, and there was a second, brief, poorly managed on her part, where she didn't look away fast enough. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was thinking." "About?" "The pump valve," she said, which was a lie so transparent it was almost insulting to both of them. He held her gaze for a moment, then went back to his book. If he recognized the lie, and she thought he probably did because he was not a stupid man, he had the grace not to say so. The men came on a Thursday, in the last week of February. Lenora heard them before she saw them. The particular sound of horses moving deliberately in the dark, more than one, holding back from a gallop in the way that horses do when their riders are trying to be quiet. It was just past 2 in the morning. She was already half awake, which she'd been most nights lately, and she was sitting up before the sound fully registered. She was at the window in 12 seconds. She'd counted once, practicing, in the daylight, to know what 12 seconds looked like. 4 riders coming up the road toward the property, stopping short of the gate. The moonlight was thin. Clouds had moved in during the evening, but there was enough to see shapes. She dressed in the dark, coat, boots, the rifle from beside the door. She was across the floor toward the back to wake Rowan, and he was already standing in his doorway, dressed, rifle in hand, which meant he'd heard them too. They looked at each other. 4, she said quietly. "I saw," he said. "Dunn's son is supposed to be, I know, he should be in the south field." The question of whether young Martin Dunn was actually where he was supposed to be at 2 in the morning in February was something they couldn't answer from inside the house. Rowan moved to the front window and studied the yard. Lenora went to the side window. The 4 men had dismounted and left their horses at the road. They were moving on foot toward the property now, and the way they were moving, spread out, purposeful, not talking, told her everything Sutton's warning had told her, but made it real in her body in a way that the warning hadn't. "They're going for the barn," Rowan said quietly. She looked. He was right. The angle of their approach aimed them at the barn rather than the house. Livestock, feed, the structure itself. "If they fire it," she started. "I know." He was already at the door. "Stay inside." "I am absolutely not staying inside." He turned to look at her. It was dark enough that she couldn't read his expression entirely, but she could read the shape of it, the particular frustrated resignation of a man realizing that an argument was going to cost him more time than it was worth. "Then stay behind me," he said. "Fine." They went out the back and came around the north side of the house, moving along the wall and then cutting across the yard through the shadow of the woodpile. The cold hit hard after the warmth of the house. Lenora's breath was fogging and she made herself slow it, made herself breathe lower because fog was visible and she didn't want to be visible yet. Rowan stopped at the corner of the woodpile and she stopped beside him. The 4 men were at the barn door now. One of them was doing something with the latch. 2 had what looked like wooden-handled tools, she couldn't see clearly enough, and the 4th was standing back watching the yard, a lookout. The lookout was facing mostly north, which put his back 3/4 toward them. Then a sound from the south field. Movement. And a voice. Young Martin Dunn's voice, higher than it wanted to be, doing its best to sound older, carrying across the cold air. Hey, who's out there?" The 4 men went still. The lookout turned, and then Rowan stepped out from the shadow of the woodpile. Not running, not crouching. He just walked out into the moonlight, such as it was, and stood in the open yard between the woodpile and the barn, and he didn't raise the rifle. He held it at his side and he stood there. Lenora stayed at the corner of the woodpile, her own rifle up, watching. Her heart was doing something complicated. She kept her breathing slow. The lookout had seen Rowan. The other three had turned from the barn door. Nobody moved for a moment. "Evening," Rowan said. His voice came out level and clear in the cold air. Not loud, just audible. Like a man making ordinary conversation with four other men at 2 a.m. in a stranger's yard. No answer. "This is private property," he said. "You know that." Still not a shout, still not aggressive. Just a statement of fact, delivered as if he expected it to be received as one. "I'm going to need you to leave it." One of the men, the largest, standing near the barn door, shifted his weight. "Who the hell are you?" he said. "Rowan Mercer. This is my property." A brief pause. "My wife's property. Same thing." Martin Dunn's footsteps were coming up from the south now. Lenora could hear them crunching in the frozen grass. From across the road, from somewhere in the dark, another sound. Horses being ridden in at a distance. Dunn himself, or Caldwell, or one of the others. Someone on watch had seen or heard something and sent word. The large man looked at his companions. A quick look, sideways, the kind that's doing a calculation. Rowan hadn't moved. He was just standing there in the cold and the dark, in the yard of a ranch he'd arrived at 4 months ago, not knowing anyone in it, and he was standing like a man who had decided exactly where he was and was not interested in being somewhere else. "There are 4 of you," the large man said. His voice had changed slightly. Not afraid, not exactly, but recalculating. "Yes," Rowan said, "and there'll be more in about 3 minutes, I'd estimate." He looked up the road briefly, at the sounds coming from that direction, then back at the 4 men. "The people in this valley have been watching for you. We knew you were coming. We just didn't know exactly when." The large man was quiet for a moment. "You're bluffing." "I might be," Rowan said agreeably. "You could wait and find out, or you could leave. Either way, the decision happens in the next 30 seconds, because after that, it gets harder to make." Lenora watched. Her finger was alongside the trigger guard, not on it. She was aware of Martin Dunn arriving at the south edge of the yard, stopping when he saw the scene. She was aware of the sound from the road getting closer. She was most aware of Rowan, standing in the open, without cover, having made a choice that was either very brave or very stupid, and that the next 30 seconds would determine which. The large man said something to the others. Low, she couldn't catch it. Then he turned back toward the road and walked. The other 3 followed. They mounted their horses at the gate and rode back the way they'd come. Not fast, that would have conceded too much, but steadily, without looking back. Rowan watched them go. Martin Dunn let out a breath that was mostly a word Lenora decided not to register. Dunn himself arrived a minute later on horseback, taking in the scene with the strained face of a man who'd ridden hard through the cold. "They gone?" he said. "Gone," Rowan said. "Are you?" Dunn looked at Rowan's hands, then at Lenora. "Nobody got—" "No," Lenora said. "No one got hurt." She walked across the yard to stand beside Rowan. Up close, in the thin moonlight, she could see that he was not entirely steady. His jaw was tight, and there was something in his breathing that was the controlled aftermath of adrenaline. He was human, was what it was. He'd been afraid. He'd stood in that yard anyway, and she could see both things at once in his face, and for some reason it was the fear that moved her more than the standing. "You walked out there without cover," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd planned. "Yes." "You had no way to know what they'd do." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." That was... She stopped, decided not to finish the sentence the way she'd started it, which would have been something like the most reckless thing I've watched a person do. Instead, she said, "You didn't hesitate." He looked at her. In the dark, his eyes had that complicated gray-green quality that she'd filed away on the first day and brought out more frequently than she cared to admit. "There wasn't time to hesitate," he said. "There was," she said. "You chose not to." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's your barn," he said, as if this were the complete explanation. She looked at him. He looked at her. The cold was very present, and the yard smelled like snow and horse and the faint wood smoke from the stove inside. And Dunn was saying something somewhere behind them, and Martin was answering, and none of that was the most present thing for a moment that lasted a beat too long for either of them to explain cleanly. Lenora looked away first. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." Dunn stayed an hour, drinking coffee, the four of them sitting around the kitchen table in the strange, slightly euphoric manner of people who have just avoided something bad and haven't fully processed it yet. Martin fell asleep in his chair by the third cup, which was the specific privilege of being 19 years old. They kept their voices low around him. "They'll try again," Dunn said. "Maybe," Rowan said. "Or they'll go somewhere else. Harder targets get abandoned for easier ones, usually." "We're not an easy target anymore," Lenora said. "No," Dunn said. He looked at Rowan across the table with an expression that was more than acknowledgement, something more like respect, the kind that arrives late and is more solid for having arrived that way. "You want to tell me why you walked out there without the rifle up? Because I would have had it up. If I come out without the rifle up, someone makes a calculation about whether he can draw before I fire," Rowan said. "That's a calculation I don't want anyone making. If I come out just standing there, the calculation is different. It's, do we want to start something with someone who's comfortable enough to just stand here?" He paused. "Most men don't." Dunn absorbed this. "You've done that before," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Rowan didn't answer, which was itself an answer. They left it there. In the morning, Lenora wrote to Aldous Crane and told him what had happened. She described the four men, their approach, the tools they'd carried. She wrote it with the flat precision her father's schoolteacher standards had given her, and then she wrote a second version for the Helena paper's editor, with slightly more texture. She sent both. Rowan spent the morning reinforcing the barn latch and adding a crossbar to the door that he'd fashioned from spare lumber in the back of the tool shed. She could hear him working while she wrote, the solid, methodical sounds of construction, and she found it helped her concentrate. Proof, she supposed, that you could get used to almost anything, given enough time. Around midday, she brought him water and found him sitting on the edge of the water trough. Not working, just sitting. He had a piece of wood in his hands that he was turning over and over without looking at it, which was what he did when something was occupying his mind. "What?" she said. "Thinking," he said. "About?" He was quiet for a moment. About whether last night was the end of it or the middle of it. She sat down beside him on the trough. The sun was out, and it was still brutally cold, but the sun helped. "What's your instinct?" "Middle," he said. "Mine too." She looked at the barn door, the new crossbar. "We need Crane to move faster." "I'll write to him," Rowan said. "Sometimes a second voice speeds things up." She nodded. Then, because she'd been thinking about it since the night before and hadn't found a way to say it that wasn't strange. "What you did last night, standing out there—" She stopped, started again. "I know you said it was the barn, but I want you to know that—" She stopped again. "I'm not good at this," she said flatly, "saying things that are not practical." He looked at her sideways. There was that quality that was almost humor, barely visible. "You're doing all right," he said. "What I mean is—" She looked at the mountains, which was easier than looking at him. "I'm glad you're here. That's what I mean. Not as an employee and not because of the deed arrangement, just—" She ran out of words, which was unusual for her and irritating. "I know," he said quietly. "You do?" "Yes." He looked at the mountains too. "I'm glad I'm here too." It was not a declaration of anything. It was two honest people saying a true thing in the winter sun, on the edge of a water trough, on a ranch that someone was still trying to take from them. It was not enough, and it was also, in its own way, a great deal. Lenora stood up. "The pump valve needs ordering," she said. "I'll write in tomorrow," he said. She went back to the house. She was aware, going up the steps, of being watched, not uncomfortably. The way you're aware of the sun on your back, which is warm and doesn't demand anything. She went inside and locked nothing away. She put more wood on the fire and got back to work. Crane's second letter arrived in the first week of March, and it was longer than the first. He had filed a formal challenge to Consolidated Range's water rights claim in the territorial court in Helena. He had attached to it signed statements from 4 Valley property owners, the incident report Lenora had sent describing the February night, and a separate document outlining a pattern of similar pressure tactics the company had used in 2 other territories over the preceding decade. Information he'd obtained through a contact at a land reform organization in Denver that tracked this sort of thing. The challenge would not be resolved quickly, he wrote, but it was now a matter of public record, which changed the nature of the company's exposure considerably. He also wrote in the final paragraph in language that was dry and precise and nonetheless carried something almost like feeling. The actions taken by the residents of this valley and the documentation they have provided represent exactly the kind of organized response that makes legal remedy possible. I want you to know that this case is not merely an interesting professional matter to me. I have seen what these companies do to families who have no one to stand with them. I'm glad you have had someone to stand with you. Lenora read it twice. Then she put it in the wooden box where she kept the important papers and went to find Rowan. He was at the pump, which had its new valve now, installed correctly on the first try, which Rowan had seemed unreasonably satisfied by. She showed him the letter without preamble. He read it standing in the yard with the March wind moving through and his coat open because he'd been working and hadn't felt the cold yet. "It's moving," he said. "Slowly," she said. "Yes, but in the right direction." He folded the letter and handed it back. "Have you told Dunn?" "I'll ride over this afternoon." He nodded. Then, "You should feel good about this." She looked at him. "You organized it," he said. "The coalition, the lawyer, the paper, that was you." "It was all of us." "It was you first," he said, and he said it plainly, without performance, the way he said things he meant. Then he went back to the pump. She stood in the yard for a moment with the letter in her hand and the wind in her hair and felt something that wasn't quite victory. It was too soon for that, but was something in that general direction. Something that had been closed for a long time, making a small tentative movement toward open. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they had a different texture than what had come before. March gave way to a grudging, reluctant April, the snow pulling back from the lower ground and leaving mud and the pale suggestion of last year's grass beneath. The cattle began to look less like they were enduring and more like they were recovering. Spite the mare had foaled in late February, a difficult delivery that had kept Rowan up most of the night and left him hollow-eyed at breakfast. And the foal, a dark brown colt with one white sock, had been named by Lenora on an impulse she'd immediately felt slightly embarrassed by. "Henry," she'd said, looking at the colt trying out its legs in the barn the morning after. Rowan had looked at her. "Henry. Thomas's father's name," she said. "He built this ranch. Seemed appropriate." Rowan had looked at the colt. "Henry," he said again, as if testing it. Then, "He doesn't look like a Henry. He'll grow into it." The colt had looked at them both with the large, dark, entirely untroubled eyes of something that had been alive for approximately 6 hours and found the world acceptable so far. "Henry," Rowan said, and this time there was definitely something in his voice that was almost a smile, and Lenora had gone back to the house before she could respond to it in any way she'd need to account for later. No more men came from Consolidated Range. This was not the same as safety. They were all clear-eyed enough to understand that, but the absence of direct threat allowed other things to grow in its place, and one of those things was something approaching normalcy. The watch rotation continued for another 3 weeks and then eased by mutual agreement to every other night, and then to a standby arrangement where anyone who saw or heard something would send word. The valley was not at peace exactly, but it was watchful in a collective way now rather than in the isolated, frightened way it had been. That was different. That was worth something. It was the second week of April when the storm came that changed everything. Not the storm itself. The storm was the kind that arrived without fanfare in Montana, sudden and serious, dropping 18 inches of wet snow in 36 hours and then clearing as if nothing had happened. The trouble was what the storm carried with it, which was Dale Sutton, alone, on foot, 3 miles from the nearest shelter, in the dark. Rowan found him. He'd gone out to check the eastern fence line in the hour before the worst of the storm hit. A fence he'd repaired twice and didn't trust in heavy wet snow, and on his way back he'd nearly walked into Sutton sitting in the snow against a boulder at the edge of the road, jacket inadequate, no hat, shaking so hard the sound of it was audible. His horse apparently had thrown him an hour back and run. He'd walked the wrong direction in the dark and the snow and arrived here instead of anywhere useful. Rowan got him on his feet and half carried him the half-mile back to the ranch. He would tell Lenora later that he'd considered for a moment the various things he could do. The road went two directions, and one of them eventually led to town. But it was dark, and it was snowing harder every minute, and whatever Sutton was or wasn't, leaving a man in a Montana snowstorm in April with no hat and inadequate clothing was not something Rowan was capable of doing. Lenora was at the window when they came in through the yard, and she saw them a moment before the door opened, and she had exactly the amount of time it takes to walk from a window to a kitchen door to decide how she felt about this. The door opened. Rowan came in supporting a man who could barely stand. Snow on both of them, ice in Sutton's mustache, the man's skin a color that was no color a human face should be. Lenora looked at Sutton. Sutton looked at her with eyes that were exhausted and embarrassed and about 30 minutes from something more serious. "Get him to the chair," she said, "the one by the stove." Rowan did. Lenora pulled a blanket from the chest in the corner, the heavy one, wool, that she used for the worst nights, and put it around Sutton's shoulders without looking at his face. She put a pot of water on. She crouched in front of the stove and fed it more wood until it was burning as hot as it would go. Sutton's teeth were making a noise. "Can you feel your hands?" she asked. "Some," he said. "Your feet?" Yes, mostly. Tell me if that changes." She stood. "Rowan, get his boots off." Rowan did, and Sutton was apparently not beyond noticing the indignity of the situation, because he made a motion as if to resist and then thought better of it. "My horse," he started. "Your horse is fine," Lenora said. She didn't actually know this, but it was more likely true than not, and certainly more useful than the alternative. "Stop talking and get warm." For 20 minutes, nobody said anything meaningful. The stove worked. The water heated. Lenora made something approximating tea from what she had in the cabinet, and Rowan sat at the table with his own cup, watching the fire and saying nothing, which was his particular skill deployed appropriately. The color came back into Sutton's face. He stopped shaking. He held the tea with both hands and stared at the floor. "Well," he said finally. His voice was still rough but functional. "Well," Lenora said. He looked up at her. There was something in his expression that she hadn't seen there before. Not the professionally pleasant certainty of the man who'd ridden into her yard in October on behalf of a company that believed it had all the cards. Something scraped raw. "I owe you," he started. "You don't owe me anything yet," she said. "You can sleep in the outbuilding tonight. It's warmer than it looks, and there's a cot. Tomorrow, when the storm clears, you can find your horse or get to town." He was quiet for a moment. I know what I could have done," she said. "I didn't do it. That doesn't require a discussion." Sutton looked at Rowan. Something passed between them, a recognition, man to man, about something Lenora wasn't entirely part of. Rowan held his gaze and said nothing. "I've been let go," Sutton said. Lenora looked at him. "The company," he turned the cup in his hands. "2 weeks ago. They found out about what I told you. In January. Someone saw me leave here." He exhaled slowly. So you rode out here tonight, why?" Rowan said. Not unkindly, just the question. "I didn't ride out here," Sutton said, with the rueful expression of a man who'd lost an argument with the weather. "I was riding through. I'm leaving the territory. I have a sister in Oregon." Lenora looked at this man who had stood in her yard on a horse, looking down at her, telling her that her water rights were legally ambiguous and winter changed calculations. He looked considerably smaller at her kitchen table in a borrowed blanket. Not pathetic, she didn't feel contempt for him, which surprised her somewhat, just reduced to human size, which was apparently where he'd been all along under the professional certainty. "Before you go," she said, "the company. What are they planning, now that the legal challenge is filed?" He was quiet for a moment. "They're pulling back," he said. "I heard it before they let me go. The Helena thing, the public record, it's more exposure than they want on this particular play. There are easier places." He paused. "That's not a guarantee. I'm telling you what I heard. But the water rights case, they won't continue funding it if the cost gets too high," he said. That's how they make these calculations. Margin. If the margin on this valley's water rights doesn't justify the legal cost and the public attention," he stopped. They'll move on. Lenora sat with that. Rowan was looking at his cup. You could write it down, Rowan said. What you know about how the company operates, what you've seen them do. Sign it. Give it to Crane. Sutton looked at him. That would make things difficult for me. More difficult than they already are? Rowan said, and he said it without cruelty, just matter-of-factly, which was somehow worse and also more honest. Sutton was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. Outside, the storm was absolute. The sound of it against the roof was like something alive and determined. Do you have paper? Sutton said. Lenora got paper. He wrote for 40 minutes, slowly and carefully, stopping occasionally to think and then continuing. Rowan and Lenora moved around the kitchen without talking much. She made food, he tended the stove, the ordinary choreography of the space that they'd developed without deciding to. And Sutton wrote. When he was done, he had 4 pages, and he signed each one, and Lenora watched him do it with the same feeling she'd had watching Rowan stand in the yard in the February dark. The feeling of a thing happening that couldn't be undone, and all the weight that came with that. I'll send this to Crane, she said. I know, Sutton said. This helps people who didn't deserve what your company did to them. He looked at her. His face had that scraped raw quality again. I know that too, he said. She put the pages in the box with the deed and Crane's letters and the other things she was keeping safe. When she turned back, Sutton was looking at the kitchen in a way she recognized. The way you look at a place that has a particular quality of warmth to it, not just from the stove, but from habitation, from people who have been there long enough to leave something of themselves in it. You've done well here, he said. It was not directed at either of them specifically. It was just something he said, quietly, almost to himself. Rowan showed him to the outbuilding with a lantern, and Lenora listened to their footsteps cross the yard, and then return. Rowan's alone, coming back through the snow. He came in and stamped his boots and hung up his coat and came to the stove to warm his hands. He'll be all right, he said, meaning Sutton. I know, she said. They stood at the stove for a moment, not talking. The storm went on. Everything outside was white and erased, and the house held them in its particular warmth. The walls that Thomas and his father had built. The floor Lenora had scrubbed more times than she could count. The window that was still off by half an inch and probably always would be. Rowan, she said. Yes. When Crane's case resolves. She stopped, reorganized herself. When this is over, the legal situation, all of it. She looked at the stove door rather than at him. The year we agreed to. It'll be past. He was very still beside her. I'm aware of that, he said carefully. I want to... She stopped again. This was genuinely difficult, and she did not find things genuinely difficult often, and she resented it slightly. I made an agreement with you, she said. A practical one. And I want you to know that you've more than held your end of it, and I'm not going to make any claims on you past what we agreed. If you want to leave when it's done, you can leave. The fire in the stove breathed. The storm pressed against the glass. Is that what you want? He asked. His voice was careful in the way voices go when the words underneath the words are the ones that matter. No, she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. No, it's not what I want, but I'm not going to... She made a frustrated motion with her hand. I don't know how to do this, Rowan. I don't know how to want something from a person and not make it a transaction or a... Lenora, he said. She stopped. I'm not leaving, he said. Simple. No decoration on it. She looked at him. The year? I'm not leaving, he said again. I should have said that more plainly before now. I'm sorry I didn't. The storm was very loud. Somewhere in the barn, Henry the colt was new and didn't know yet what winter meant, in spite his mother was keeping him warm. The pages in the wooden box had 4 signatures on them. Spring was somewhere under all that snow, getting ready. Lenora looked at Rowan's face, which was not a perfect face, the jaw too strong, the eyes too watchful, carrying things he would take a long time to fully put down, and she felt, with a clarity she hadn't expected, that she was done managing the distance between them. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the shelf above the stove, and he turned his hand over so it wasn't just being covered but was holding back, and they stood like that in the warmth of their own kitchen while the storm did what storms do, raged and spent itself, and eventually, inevitably, ran out of weather. Sutton left the following morning when the storm had cleared and the world had gone painfully bright under 18 inches of new snow. His horse had found its way to Dunn's property overnight, which Dunn's boy brought over without being asked, and Sutton stood in the yard with the animal in his inadequate jacket and his 4 signed pages already on their way to Helena inside Lenora's wooden box. And he looked like a man who had set something down that he'd been carrying a long time, and wasn't sure yet whether he felt lighter or just empty. "Oregon's not bad," Rowan said. He was leaning against the gatepost with his coffee, watching the mountains do what they did after a heavy snow, which was stand there being enormous and indifferent and very white. "So I'm told," Sutton said. He put his hat on, looked at Lenora. "I meant what I said last night, about what you've built here." "I know you did," she said. He mounted and rode south without looking back. Lenora watched him until the road bent and took him out of sight, and she wasn't sure what she felt exactly. Not forgiveness, not in the clean, completed sense that word usually implied. More like the recognition that people were complicated in ways that made simple judgments inadequate. Sutton had done harm and then done something that mitigated it, not enough to cancel the ledger, but enough to matter, and she supposed that was the most honest version of how most people moved through the world. Doing some harm, some good, rarely keeping a clean account. She went inside and wrote to Crane. The letter she sent him included Sutton's 4 pages, a summary of what he'd said about the company's calculations regarding margin and exposure, and a request for Crane's assessment of how this changed their position. She wrote it at the kitchen desk in the morning light, and Rowan sat at the table behind her drinking his second coffee and reading, actually reading this time, actually turning pages, which she noticed and said nothing about. Crane's response came 12 days later, and it was the best letter she had ever received in her life, which was a low bar given the recent correspondence, but nonetheless. The company had withdrawn the water rights challenge, formally, in writing, filed with the territorial court. Crane had it on record. The legal threat to the Ashcombe property, the Dunn property, the Caldwell spread, and Francis Bauer's 40 acres was over. Sutton's signed statement, combined with the documented pattern from the Denver organization and the very public nature of the Helena filing, had apparently completed whatever calculation the company had been running. The cost had exceeded the margin. They had found somewhere else to be. Crane's letter ended with a bill, which was painful, and a handwritten note at the bottom that said simply, "Well done, both of you." Lenora sat at the desk for a long moment after reading it. The house was quiet. Outside, she could hear the first real sounds of April, a bird somewhere. The particular drip of snow melting off the eaves in the midday warmth, the distant sound of the creek that had been frozen solid since December beginning to find its voice again. Rowan came in from outside, stamping mud from his boots, and she turned in the chair and held out the letter without a word. He read it standing just inside the door. When he finished, he set it on the table. He didn't whoop or grin or perform relief. He exhaled through his nose, once, long and slow, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "It's over," he said. "It's over," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. And what passed between them in that moment was something that had been building since October, through bad nights and cold mornings, and the sound of 4 riders in the dark, and the feel of a hand held over a stove while a storm spent itself outside. And it was not simple and it was not neat, but it was absolutely real, which they had both learned to value considerably more than simple or neat. "I want to go tell Dunn," she said. "I'll get the horses," he said. They rode out together into the April morning, and the valley was all mud and snowmelt and pale new sky. And it was not beautiful in any postcard sense. It was the kind of beautiful that requires you to have earned it, to have spent a hard winter in it, to know what it looked like when it was trying to kill you, so that when it relented you understood what you were looking at. Dunn cried. He would have been mortified to know that Lenora saw it, so she looked away when his eyes went and gave him a moment to collect himself. Ruth Dunn did not cry. She stood in her kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, and her expression the specific one of a woman who had known it would work out, because she had decided it would, and who found the confirmation satisfying rather than surprising. "We should do something," Dunn said when he'd recovered. "Get people together. Celebrate." "In the spring," Lenora said, when the road is passable and people aren't half buried. May, Dunn said. I'll talk to Francis and Caldwell. We'll do it properly. She let him plan it. Planning was how Dunn processed things, and it gave him something to do with the relief. They told Caldwell on the way back. He shook Rowan's hand for a long time and said nothing, which was the most Caldwell ever said about anything. They stopped at Frances Bowers because her property was on the way and Frances had earned the news in person. Frances read the letter herself, handed it back, and said, Good. Now I can get the north fence fixed without wondering if it's worth it. And that was that. On the ride home, Rowan and Lenora didn't talk much. The valley moved past them, muddy and beginning, and the mountains held their snow, and the creek ran loud, and the sky was the particular clear blue that only appeared in Montana in early spring, as if the winter had scoured everything clean and left this in its place. I want to expand the herd, Lenora said, this summer, if we can get the capital. We can, Rowan said. If we sell 2 of the older steers in May and put the money back in, we have enough to buy 4 young head, maybe 5. She looked at him sideways. You've been doing the arithmetic. I've been thinking about it, he said. He paused, thinking about what the place could be, with time. What do you think it could be? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the land, not evasively, thinking. Solid, he said finally. Not big, just solid. The kind of operation that holds up through bad years because it's built right, not because you got lucky. She thought about that. My husband wanted it to be big, she said. He had plans, big plans, hundreds of head, a proper operation. What did you want? She hadn't been asked that, specifically, in a long time. Not about the ranch, not in that particular way. What she wanted, as opposed to what Thomas had wanted. What the ranch needed, what survival required. The question caught her somewhere soft. I wanted it to last, she said. I wanted it to be something that was still here when I was done with it. Something that outlasted me. Rowan nodded slowly. That's a better plan, he said. They put the horses up and Lenore made dinner, which was nothing special. Salt pork and beans and the last of the dried apples she'd been rationing since January. And they ate at the kitchen table as they'd eaten dozens of times now. In the kitchen that was warm and smelled like wood smoke and the particular lived-in smell of a place that had been cared for. And the off-plumb window frame caught the evening light the way it always did, casting a slightly crooked rectangle on the floor. Rowan looked at it. Thomas's window, he said. Yes, she said. You're never going to fix it, are you? It wasn't really a question. No, she said. He nodded, went back to his food, and that was as much as needed to be said about that. The second wedding, which was how Lenora thought of it privately, though she'd never said that to anyone, happened in May, on a Saturday, in the yard of the Ashcombe Ranch under a sky that was cooperating for once, clear and warm and generous. It had been Dunn's idea originally, framed as a celebration of the legal victory, and Lenora had agreed without immediately understanding what it would become. What it became was something she hadn't expected to want and found, on the day of it, that she wanted very much. 30 people came. This was most of the valley, including people who had whispered about her in October, and who arrived in May carrying food and something approximating sheepishness, which she accepted without making them explain themselves, because she understood that people were afraid of things they didn't understand and that fear usually expressed itself as judgment, and that the cure for it was usually just time and evidence, and they had both now. Eleanor Marsh came. She arrived with a pie and a careful expression and said, Lenora, I owe you an apology. And Lenora said, You don't need to. And Eleanor said, I want to. And so Lenora let her, and it was brief and slightly uncomfortable for both of them, and then it was done and they moved on, which was how apologies should work, not as extended performances, but as acknowledgments that clear the ground for what comes after. Frances Bower brought her hound dog without being invited to do so, and the dog ate part of Caldwell's contribution to the food table, and Caldwell was philosophical about it. Dunn had found a fiddle player from somewhere, a young man named Abner who was better than anyone had expected. And there was music from mid-afternoon on, which meant there was dancing, which meant the children ran in circles around the adults' legs and eventually fell asleep under the tables, which was the right way for children to end a celebration. Rowan and Lenora stood in front of Harold Gear again. The same Harold Gear, with the same glasses at the end of his nose, who had performed the original 10-minute ceremony in his office above the hardware store with Mabel and the sound of hammering as witnesses. Gear looked between them. He looked at the 30 people arranged in the yard. He looked at the mountains behind the property, still holding some snow at the peaks, and the creek visible at the south edge of the land, running bright and clear and entirely legally theirs. "Well," Gear said, with a dryness that Lenora suspected he'd been cultivating for 30 years. "You two want to do this again properly?" "Yes," Lenora said. "Yes," Rowan said. "Any objections this time?" Gear asked the assembled crowd with the air of a man making a small joke, and there were none, and Dunn said about time from somewhere in the back, which made Ruth elbow him in the ribs. Gear read the words. The same words, more or less, but words change depending on the people holding them and the weight they've accumulated. And these had accumulated a winter's worth of weight, the weight of bad nights and cold mornings and letters to lawyers and a man standing in a dark yard with a rifle at his side and a hand held over a stove while a storm ran out of weather outside. When Gear told Rowan he could kiss his bride, Rowan turned to Lenora and looked at her for a moment in the particular way he had, direct, unhurried, with the quality of a man who had stopped performing anything, and then he kissed her properly, not on the cheek, and it was not brief, and Dunn made a noise that got him another elbow, and 30 people were gracious enough to be loud about their approval. Lenora had expected to feel self-conscious. She did not feel self-conscious. She felt standing in her own yard in the May sun with the creek running and Henry the colt visible through the fence being exactly as unimpressed by the proceedings as a young horse could be, something that she had stopped believing she would feel again after Thomas died. Not happy in the simple, frictionless sense that she'd never entirely trusted anyway, but present. Fully, solidly, unreservedly present in her own life, which was something she'd been working her way back to for 14 months. It would not always be easy. She knew that. Rowan still had bad nights, and she still had the mornings where grief arrived without warning, like weather, and they were both people who'd lost things and rebuilt around the loss and carried the shape of what was missing somewhere in the way they moved through the world. They would argue because they were two people with opinions, and those arguments would sometimes be about the ranch, and sometimes about things that weren't quite about the ranch, but felt like it was safer to make them about the ranch. He would keep fixing things without being asked. She would keep the accounts to herself longer than was probably reasonable. They would both forget sometimes to say the things that were better said out loud, and would have to learn that lesson more than once. None of that was failure. She understood that now in a way she hadn't when she was younger, that the presence of difficulty was not the absence of rightness, that you didn't measure the quality of something by how smooth it ran, but by whether it was worth the friction. This was worth it. She was certain of that in the way she was certain of very few things. Later, after the food was gone and Abner had played his fiddle until his arm gave out, and the children had been peeled off the ground and taken home, and the last of the guests had ridden down the road with lanterns swinging in the new dark, Lenora and Rowan sat on the steps of the porch in the warm May night. The valley was quiet. The creek talked to itself in the dark. The mountains were black shapes against a sky full of stars. Rowan had his elbows on his knees. Lenora had her arms around her own knees. Neither of them had cleaned up yet. That was tomorrow's work. And the yard still had the evidence of 30 people having been there. Extra chairs, a length of bunting Dunn's wife had brought, the impression of boots in the soft spring ground. "Francis's dog ate half the food on that table," Rowan said. "I know." Caldwell didn't say a word about it. Caldwell is a reasonable man. Caldwell was afraid of Francis. "Caldwell is a wise man," she said, and Rowan made a sound that was a real laugh. Not the almost smile, not the almost humor she'd been catching the edges of for months, but an actual laugh, short and real and unguarded, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest. They sat in the quiet. A coyote said something distant and unanswered. Henry moved in the barn, young and untroubled. "My father would have hated all of this," Lenora said. "The wedding or the frontier?" "Both," she said. "He thought the West was where people went when they couldn't manage civilization." She paused. He wasn't entirely wrong, but he was wrong about what that meant. "What does it mean?" She looked at the stars. "It means you have to make everything from scratch. Laws, community, what you owe to each other. You can't just import the rules from somewhere else and expect them to fit, because the land is different and the conditions are different and the people are different. She paused. It's harder. But when you build something out here, it's actually yours. You know every nail in it. Rowan was quiet for a moment. My father was a farmer who never owned his land, he said. Tenant farming, his whole life, somebody else's property. A pause. I used to think that was just bad luck. Now I think it shapes something in a person, the way they hold themselves. He looked at the yard, the barn, the spring that ran somewhere beyond the fence in the dark. Owning something matters, not in a greedy way, in a you know what you're responsible for way. She looked at him. Is that why you stayed? Really? He considered the question seriously, the way he always did, which she had long since stopped finding slow and now found simply honest. Partly, he said, and partly because of you, honestly. He said it simply, without any kind of delivery on it, just as a fact he was stating clearly for the record. I haven't been, in a place, in a long time, haven't had a reason to be. He looked at the mountains. I have a reason now. She reached over and put her hand in his. Not a dramatic gesture, just a thing that happened between two people who had stopped pretending there were reasons not to. The stars moved overhead the way they always did, indifferent to the specific dramas of specific people, following their own enormous logic. The valley breathed in the dark. The spring ran on, water over stone, cold and clear and entirely present. In the years that followed, the Ashcombe Ranch, the Mercer Ranch, as some people began to call it, or the Ashcombe Mercer Place, which was the version Lenora preferred because it carried both histories at once, became something that its valley was quietly proud of. Not the biggest operation in the territory, not the most profitable, but the kind of place that lasted, that held its shape through dry years and hard winters, that expanded carefully when it could and pulled back sensibly when it had to. The herd grew slowly and well. Henry turned out to be an excellent horse, despite Rowan's early doubts about the name, and was used for ranch work until he was too old for it, at which point he retired to the south pasture and stood around looking self-satisfied, which Lenora said was his right. The eastern fence never gave them trouble again. The pump valve held. People came through, travelers, families who'd lost their footing, men and women moving between one place and another with nothing but what they were carrying, and the ranch became known for being a place where you could stop, where you'd be fed, where someone would look at your situation without judgment and help you figure out what came next. This was not an organized charity. It was not a policy. It was just what happened when two people who had each arrived at the bottom of something decided to use what they'd built for more than themselves. The valley survived. The other ranchers, Dunn, Caldwell, Francis Bauer, Pike Emmett, held their land and built what they'd come west to build, slowly and with difficulty and with the particular satisfaction of things earned. Aldous Crane sent a Christmas letter every year until he retired, always brief, always ending with some variation of, I trust you are both well, and still making the company's lawyers wish they'd chosen a different profession. Lenora kept the letter in the wooden box. She kept all of them. One evening in their third autumn together, she found Rowan in the barn after dark. Not working this time, just standing with Henry, who had lowered his large head and was resting it against Rowan's shoulder in the trusting, ridiculous way horses sometimes offered themselves to people they'd decided they could afford to trust. Rowan had one hand resting on the horse's neck and was looking at nothing in particular with the expression she knew best from him now. Not the careful management of distance she'd seen in the early months, but something quieter, something that had found its ground. She leaned in the doorway. The barn smelled like hay and horse and the warm darkness of a space that was used and cared for. Outside, the Montana night was doing what Montana nights did in autumn, going big and cold and full of stars that made everything underneath them seem briefly comprehensible, as if the scale of the sky gave you permission to know where you stood. Rowan, she said. Yes, he said, without turning. Come inside, it's cold. He gave Henry a pat on the neck, and the horse lifted his head with the dignified expression of someone interrupted at something important. Rowan came to the door and stopped beside her and looked at the sky for a moment, the way he had a habit of doing, not dramatically, just briefly, like checking a compass. Then he put his arm around her shoulders, and she put her arm around his waist, and they walked back to the house together across the dark yard, the light from the kitchen window falling yellow and warm on the ground ahead of them, showing them exactly how far they had to go and the way clear all the way to the door.